And here we go. Good evening. Good evening. Sean, what's up, man? It's good to see you, sir.
Hey, good to be here. Thank
Good
you.
to have you on
nice
to
to join you.
Wittick. Thank you, man. I appreciate you
Yeah.
popping in.
Thanks for having me.
I got to tell everybody the story of how you got here right quick. This is day 5 of the VLOGMAS challenge. The VLOGMAS challenge, for anybody that does not know, it's basically where people are saying we're going to, for the month of December, we're going to put up a blog every single, not a blog, a vlog, every single day for the month of December, from December 1. I haven't missed a day yet. I'm hoping I can get all the way through to the end of the month. But today I was looking like, I don't want to do that. I've been doing lives. I haven't been going and shooting and then editing and putting up. That's a little more work than I have time to do right now. So I've just been doing some live stuff. And I was like, man, I need to get some help with this one, so it'll be a little bit more interesting. And so I posted on my Facebook timeline, anybody got an extra 20 minutes they can throw in. And Sean, boom, he hit me. And Sean and I, we have not hooked up or seen each other. We went to high school together. I think we actually went to elementary. You went to OJA as well, right?
Elementary school too. Yes, I did.
Elementary school.
Yes,
I put our school out there. Yeah, we went to elementary school back in 2000 and I wish.
The 80s.
Back
it was
in
the 80s.
80s.
It was the 80s, man.
Yes, indeed.
the
Yeah,
80s.
we can't pull that off.
Greg gives it away.
Right away. Well, listen, man, it is good to have you with me today. So as I've been doing these vlogs, I've been doing them, as the channel says, to Wittick. It's this is what I think I know. So I'm trying to let my audience know, I don't know everything. I'm just talking about stuff that I think I know about things that I have interest in. It is breaking like every single cardinal rule of vlogging, where you're supposed to pick a topic and stay on that topic to build an audience and all that kind of stuff. I'm not really trying to build an audience. I'm trying to talk about what I want to talk about. That's what my channel is about so far. But you'll see from this end all the way across the top: history, culture, travel, food, politics, photography, scuba diving, smoothies, facial hair. Sean, you're making me look bad today, man. Technology and God. I used to have, I'll show some pictures one day. I used to have a beard that was like down to here.
I remember.
And
I remember those pictures. I've seen them on Facebook.
Cool. One of these days, I'll get them back. But yeah, so today's episode is we're going to talk. It's going to be a little cross, really, between culture and God. So it's gonna kind of straddle both of those ideals or ideas tonight. So what we want to talk about, and Sean was so gracious to come on and to share with me tonight. I wanted to talk about how do you deal with, or some 5 issues in the Bible, that old book called the Bible. There were 5 examples, I think it's 5 that we're dealing with, where we saw how people in the Bible, or how God, allowed or inspired or motivated people to deal with oppression, injustice, racism, discrimination. Those things: oppression, discrimination, injustice, and racism. And I wanted to kind of take some examples in the Bible and some people that we're going to pull out and just take a look. We're just going to have a little short discussion on the ways that they dealt with those things. One more time, just to make sure that we're all together on the same page. We're looking at 5 biblical, what's the name for that? 5 biblical examples of how people in Bible days dealt with oppression, discrimination, injustice, and racism. So, Sean, the first one I want to pull out, I want to reach in the hat, and I'm going to go with Moses. Let's take a look at Moses. So, as I was looking at Moses and I looked at how his people, remember, Moses' people, the Israelites at the time, they were slaves in Egypt. So dealing with slavery, dealing with oppression, dealing with this discrimination and injustice, they dealt with it all, right? As slaves being in Egypt. The thing that sticks out really the most about how Moses dealt with that, and I've put some taglines, I should have put them up on the screen. Moses and how he dealt with that ultimately was, deuces, peace, we're out. We're up out of here. We're getting ready to leave. We're going to leave this place, leave this land. We're going to determine our own destiny. And so the children of Israel, under Moses' leadership, and certainly under God's leadership, they get up, they pack up their entire nation, and they move, and they go to a new place where they can now establish, they can self-determine their nation's destiny. They can start their own financial system. They can start their own educational system. They can have their own banks and grocery stores and commerce. They can establish their freedom of religion. So they said, we're going to go a place where our identity will be our own. When we see that kind of thing, have we seen that kind of thing in any modern context? Can you think of any example, or does that make sense to you? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, if we're thinking about the experience of, Black people in the United States, I think of Marcus Garvey, kind of the Back to Africa movement. I don't know how many viewers are familiar with who he was, but he was a kind of a public figure in the early part of the 20th century who really advocated for the idea of Black people separating themselves and establishing kind of a new, their own. We got to take care of ourselves. It was kind of this Back to Africa movement. Wasn't the first time either. Also, after around the time of the Civil War, there was a move to establish a colony in Africa for freed slaves, which eventually that's what Liberia is the origin of that. So it's definitely been something that's been talked about, and that has happened, I guess, in a limited sense. So I mean, that's one thing that I would think of in modern application.
I think of again, and I know that there are other communities that have felt all of these things: oppression, injustice, etc. Of course, the one I'm most familiar with is Black community, because that's where I've grown up, and it's been my context.
Right.
But I think of even like currently. So when you think about George Floyd, when you think about Ahmaud Arbery, when you think about how disenfranchised a lot of Black people feel from the criminal justice system, even from education and things, there's even now there's talk about, well, we need to have our own banks. We need to have our own schools. There is some of that mentality that exists even in 2020. We need to circulate the Black dollar in the Black community rather than, and then we'll talk about, and every time that discussion pops up, we'll talk about the Jewish community and how the Jewish dollar goes around in the Jewish community like 27 times before it exits. Don't quote me on that number.
Exits,
but yeah, something like that. It goes out, and it doesn't happen like that in the Black community. And so we see some evidences of that as far as how people take some of that same kind, and I don't know if they're doing it because it's a biblical model, but the reality is that is how God led his people in Moses' day to address the issue of oppression, injustice, racism in those times. Very interesting. All right. We're going to try to keep this to about 15, 20 minutes. So there's a whole lot. And I hope that as you guys listen to this, that it may spark some discussion as you guys watch this later on. All right. The next one I want to take a look at after Moses is David. So again, now here's David and his people. Now they're not confronted so much anymore by the Egyptians. Now it's a group of people called the Philistines. And the Philistines are taking advantage of the children of Israel in a very economic way and in a very terroristic way. There's a portion of this story where you've got King Saul just before David. He's got 600 men, and they're trying to do battle against the Philistines. And the Bible says that there are only 2 swords among the people. Jonathan has one and Saul has one. The rest of the people are out there with farm tools. They're with, scathes and picks and, things like that, where the Philistines have, and they have a mill, a grind where they can sharpen. And so even if you're going to sharpen your farm tools, you have to go into the Philistines and pay them money just to do all of that. And so here's David at this point. David's, I guess if I were going to give him an epitaph as to how he was addressing that, David was like, catch these rocks. He was done with it. He was tired of it. He rolls up on this battle that is pitched where his brothers are there, and he sees this great big tall giant in the middle of the plain. Everybody knows the story, David and Goliath. David goes and he picks up these stones, and we got songs and stuff, and kids love the story. But he takes the stone, he knocks the giant out with a stone and takes the giant's sword, Goliath's sword, and cuts his own head off. David is just hardcore. David is saying, I'm not having it. We're tired of it. We're going to be strapped. We will physically lay hands on you because of what you are doing to our people. You are oppressing us. You're taking away our liberties, our freedoms, and we're just done with it. David was just hardcore. How would you look at David's response to the oppression and the injustice and the racism that was being that they were encountering in his day?
Well, I think with David, it's an interesting thing, and I almost kind of tying it back to Moses too. In both of these stories, you see a response that I think is appropriate to the circumstances. In the case of Moses, it really wasn't possible for the people of Israel to really thrive in Egypt. They weren't going to be allowed to. They were going to be there under one condition only, and that's going to be as slaves. And in the time of David, you have, not just oppression, not just, some unfairness and whatever else, but they're already essentially at war, and it was a question of who's going to survive, who's going to survive this thing. So, and of course, as you pointed out, Israel was grossly, undermatched against the Philistines. But that's where God stepped in and used David. But I think that's one of the key things is to think about what is the circumstances we're dealing with, because that has a lot to do with, I think, how we respond. But of course, there's definitely been the sense, and again, like you, I tend to go straight to the Black community because that's what I know. But I'm sure we can look at other examples as well. In all other cultures and different times and places. But immediately I think of, more of a militant type response, a response that says, I'm going to arm myself and I'm going to do what I have to do to protect my family and to protect my people. And there are people who have that view as well. Again, to me, I just think, does the circumstance warrant it? And I'm not saying it does or it doesn't. I'm just saying that's the question you have to ask, because I think the way Moses reacted and the way David reacted had very much to do with what was happening on the other end, the nature of the oppression. And that had a lot to do with how they responded. I hope that makes sense.
Wow, that's key. Yeah. So if you were to think of any modern, do we have any modern examples of, or at least that mindset? And I'm pretty sure that we do. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is the early years of Malcolm X, right? If you look at the early part of the civil rights movement, and he was not as what's the word, didn't take as violent of approach in his later years, but in his early years, it was that by any means necessary type of a mindset. Where they were like, Black Muslims would get armed and all that kind of stuff. And I think even you fast forward, what is that, 60 years, that was about 60 years ago, and you come to now, and sure, you still have groups of people who are saying, we're going to create a black militia, or again, you can put that as to whatever group feels like they are being oppressed and discriminated against, that they are saying, we're not going to take this lying down. There is a righteous battle, a righteous warfare that must take place, and there are no qualms about shedding blood in the process. that, you know, it's that
Right.
catch these rocks mindset, or yeah, that's what's going to go down. You mess with my family, you mess with my business, you mess with this, that, and the other, my rights, my you take away my ability to value myself as a man or as a woman on equal grounds, then there's going to be some fights. And we might not see that a whole bunch in a big group organized way, but you catch this on the playground, right? I mean, that's kind of something that's built into,
for sure.
Yeah. Oh, here's the other
human
place
nature,
that we do it.
And I think globally you see that that's probably the most common response. If you look, just outside the United States, when people feel, oppressed like that, it's very common for people to take up arms. That's not an uncommon response.
Yeah. It's interesting, and this is going to be a controversial point, but it's interesting that we will inside of our own country, in our schools, kids get in trouble for hitting somebody back, right? And you're a teacher, right? You're in education. So in the school system, my guess is that many schools have this zero tolerance policy for fighting. So they don't care if you got hit first. You don't hit back. Your job is to go and tell the teacher. So if the fight happened and you hit back, there's not one person being suspended or disciplined, but two kids are being suspended. I have a school. I pastor a school. I mean, my church has a school, and we got a K-8, and I know how that works. And yet on a national level, if another nation hits us, 9/11, right? We're not just going to hit back on the level that they hit us back. We're going to hit them back harder in much more of a lethal way than a kid pushing another kid because he pushed him back. Sometimes it seems like we kind of mix the messages, that we're sending our kids, even on bigger levels.
Right.
And that was totally off script and what I was trying to do. But let me jump into the other. So far we've got Moses, we've got David. The third one I want to take a look at, who is it? Oh, Gideon. So Gideon, if you guys don't remember the story of Gideon, here's Gideon. Gideon has the people are being oppressed now, not by the Egyptians nor by the Midianites. Not by the Philistines. This time it is the Midianites. And God chooses Gideon. Gideon, you're going to help get your people out of this situation of all of this oppression and all of this discrimination, all of this racism, all of this stuff that's going on. So Gideon, I want you to take 300 men. He started with a much larger army. God whittled it down. And ultimately, and I'm putting a little stretch on it, Gideon's approach to dealing with it was he's going to march. He shined some lights and he made some noise. God said, Gideon, take these 300 men, march down to the camp, take these pictures of light and light them, these torches, and then I want you to break the torches open so that the light comes, and I want you to blow the trumpet and march towards the camp. They didn't have to fight, as you know the rest of the story. They didn't fight. Their torches and their trumpets put the people in such disarray, and I believe there was some divine intervention as well. But the enemy became in such disarray that they were able to overcome overwhelming forces simply by the lights, the trumpets, and the march. How would you dissect that approach to dealing with oppression and racism and discrimination today?
Well, I think in a situation like that, you definitely have to have God on your side because, I do think God had a big part to play. And in fact, it was God that whittled down that army and said, you're not going to fight. This is the approach we're going to take. And if I was to try to stretch all the way to make that reach that you've created with that analogy, I would say that, what you have to do is, in a sense, have God on your side. You have to have a system in place that is righteous that you can appeal to. You know what I mean?
Okay.
You have to have an underlying, in other words, like when Martin Luther King, which is kind of why we think of him, I think of Black Lives Matter that way. Some people disagree, but I really feel that that's what Black Lives Matter is. It's just shining a light. It's making some noise. You're getting out there, right? Yeah. But I think with the reason that those approaches work and why they work for Gandhi in India, which was, King, Dr. King used him as a model as well, right? Is because you had two countries that were, in a sense, you could say kind of hypocritical, because they preached a certain set of values, were practicing something different. But the point is, they had these values that you could appeal to, and you could say, look, this is what this country is supposed to be. All men are created equal, and that's not what's happening here. If you were in, say, North Korea or something, I don't know that going out into the streets and marching and shining a light would have a whole lot of, because there's nothing to appeal to. So having that higher, I'm going to stretch with you, I'm going to reach with you, and instead of being God himself, it's more that higher righteousness that you can appeal to fight for you. All I got to do is shine a light on the impression, make some noise, and then that righteousness, in the case of Gideon, it was God. In the case of the United States, it's these principles that we have that we're supposed to live up to. Everybody could see, once that nonviolent approach got out there, and everybody could see the evil plain in your face, you can't miss it. We were forced to do something because we had that higher principle. And I mean, I know that people say that oh, you don't like the United States, oh, you're not patriotic, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is I'm very patriotic. I really believe in the United States. I believe in what it stands for, and particularly those values that we have not really lived up to in our country's history very well. But they're there, and we've been able to appeal to them, and that's why those approaches work. So I don't know, maybe I'm stretching too much, but that's the way I see it.
Wow, that's interesting, because as I think about that the torch, it's like, there's a lot of stuff that in a system that distributes justice unequally, or how do you say that? There's an inequity in the distribution of justice. There's a lot of that happens in the dark. And so here's Gideon. That's the kind of the stretch of the symbolism there, is that their response was, we're going to shine a light in the dark places and expose some stuff. So that's kind of, I guess, what these marches are. That's what people are doing when they're wanting to video everything now that happens in the streets. We're going to expose it. We're going to get out there and march. You brought up things like Black Lives Matter and some of those other movements. And granted, I understand that people are divided on what that's about and what that does. But the point is, you take Black Lives Matter and what you think about that off the table, and just think about people being out in the streets and protest. They are trying to bring attention. They're trying to make some noise out in those streets about the discrimination, the injustice, the inequities that exist there. Powerful, good stuff. All right, we got two more. Daniel, let's take a look at Daniel. Daniel, very different case. Still people being oppressed. But this time, Daniel's people are not fighting. Nebuchadnezzar has come in. He has demolished the kingdom of Judah. There's just like, he's ransacked the capital city, and he has taken Daniel and a whole lot of other folk captive, and they are now in Babylon. And yet Daniel did some stuff that put him in a position to fight, as it were, the oppression, the discrimination, the racism. What did that look like for Daniel?
Yeah. I think, again, I don't know why I keep coming back to this whole idea of God led his people to do what worked what was going to be effective in the situation where they were. So where Daniel was, given the level of defeat they had suffered, it really wasn't going to be practical to, march in the streets or to lead a revolt or even to leave. Really, I don't think they had the wherewithal to do that. God hadn't provided for that yet at that point. And so that was his option at the time. So it goes back to, again, what are our options? Is that what's available? But I think you think about working within the system, and I think for a lot of people are very comfortable with working within the system because it doesn't disrupt the system, and the oppression really doesn't end. But it does mean that individuals who can do well can rise in that system, and sometimes that can put them in a position to help other people. I'll tell you, I know this is who you did not be had in mind, but I couldn't help but think of this person when we're talking about that kind of working within the system, was Esther.
I knew you were going there, because I was getting ready to bring her up too. Right.
I was going to say, she not only, was able to benefit herself within the system,
Huh?
but then she was able to turn around and help her people. She was put in a
Right.
position where she could do something for the people that were her people that were oppressed. So I thought that I just
Yeah.
thought of that as we were talking about that.
Yeah, that's
But
great.
yeah, modern application, anybody, Barack Obama, anybody who's working within, they're not in the streets necessarily. They're saying, hey, listen, I can achieve, great things,
Oprah,
and be
Colin
accepted by the
Powell.
wider
Yeah.
populace.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
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 And that
Any, you can name them. Yeah.
back in the day, you would have had like a Nat King Cole. Even in the entertainment industry, you've had people who
Exactly.
And this would be almost if I were going to put that little epithet like to catch these rocks and the peace we out type thing, I would go with assimilate and excel. So Daniel assimilated into that Babylonian system to a degree, not fully. I don't think he was immersed by it, but he assimilated in it. He studied their language. He studied their sciences and all those, and excelled at it to the point where even with his buddies at the end of that 10-day fast that they had at the beginning of the story with the three Hebrew boys, they were found to be 10 times fairer and more intellectually acute than the others there. And so because of his a willingness to assimilate and excel, he was able then to rise as high as third in the kingdom, we're told. So that's a powerful thing. Now, there can be some trouble with that. People who do that, there's a term, particularly in the black community, we that individual may get called an Uncle Tom. Because he's, we don't always, within the communities that those people do that, there are some that, man, it sucks that this is our circumstance and our situation. We don't want to have anything to do with the oppressor, or the new word, I guess, is colonizer. That's the terms that we like using around. That's a colony. We don't want to have anything to do with them. Anything that looks like we're partnering or assimilating any kind of way. Then it's got, but in this case, Daniel, this is not only what Daniel did, but this was what his partners did. The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were also a part of that, and for them, it was what they. And I guess your point that what was necessary and what was useful and what was pragmatic at the time under the conditions and in the context that they found themselves in oppression and injustice, facing oppression and injustice. Great, good stuff. All right, I hope this is fodder for some thought for those of you that are watching this. Okay, last one, Sean. This is a hard one. Jesus. He's the last one, all right? So did Jesus in his time or with his people, did he experience oppression and discrimination and racism and injustice? Was he seeing that during his time? I think right out the gate we have to say yes, right? So we move from the Egyptians to who was next? The Philistines, to the Midianites, to the Babylonians, and now it's the Romans. The Romans are now in charge, and they have occupied Palestine. They've occupied this Jewish territory. This is probably the most aggressive oppression that the people have faced up to this point. Let me not say aggressive. This is probably the most systematic. The Babylonian thing was systematic as well because it reached all the way into the education system. But the Roman oppression included the education because they pulled some of that stuff from the Babylonians, from the Greeks into their own culture. But now it was even in the terms of commerce. The roads that they built throughout the area was directly associated with the money system. And that was the thing that just put the Roman occupation and oppression on a whole nother level. And then they mixed that with some whole other level cruelty stuff like crucifixion. Like mass crucifixion. This is like mass terrorism stuff that was going on in Jesus' day. So how did Jesus deal with that? Yeah. Anything come to mind? I'll start. I guess the only things I think about, it sounds almost like not just Daniel's assimilation, but it almost comes across as pacifism. And what's that thing we always say, that appeasement almost, right? So like Chamberlain in the Second World War, the whole appeasement of Nazi Germany, all that stuff. Jesus is preaching to Jews, and he's saying stuff like, if they compel you to go a mile, go 2 miles. If they take your coat, then give them your cloak also. Jesus doesn't seem like at all that he's trying to shake off the cloak of the Roman oppression. What do you think about how Jesus dealt with that stuff?
Well, the funny thing is, people like to say, what would Jesus do? And the more I study the life of Christ, the more my answer to that question is, I don't know. Because his own followers could not predict what he was going to do. And the one thing about Jesus is that there was an internal consistency that he had to how he approached things, but it didn't manifest in always him. He wasn't predictable. He wasn't always going to do things the exact same way every time. I think, he was interested in, and I'm really hesitant with this, because I find that a lot of times when we talk about issues of race and oppression today, people want to use the example of Jesus to argue for a lack of engagement at all, that is the Christian response.
Right.
That we should just focus on individual salvation, and we should not be getting people all riled up and whatever else. But I think you have to oftentimes look at what the motives are. And a lot of times when people are motivated by that, let's follow Jesus' example, and let's just focus on personal individuality. And I have a real bone to pick with this whole idea of racism as being an individual problem. I really do believe it needs to be addressed as a systemic, larger issue. But I don't want to digress too far. But what I wanted to say is I think, though, that with Jesus, his approach was not out of a need to not upset people. And I'm a people pleaser. I've been that way for my whole life, and it's one of my issues I have to deal with, as I want people to like me, I want people to agree with me. Jesus didn't have those problems. But at the same time, he didn't go the other extreme. He neither was trying to antagonize nor trying to appease. He was just something totally different. Something totally different. And his goal was not just to set the Jewish people free, but to set the Romans free as well.
Wow.
Because I think he recognized that oppression, and I think that's true today too, that racism, it hurts everybody. It's not just the people who are the oppressed, but the oppressors are damaged by it too. It's not good for anyone. And so I think his goal was not just to help one side at the expense of the other. And a lot of times we get this whole idea that there's this, zero-sum game where if we help the oppressed, then the tables will be turned, and then, we'll be the oppressed and they'll be the oppressors. But I think Jesus completely upended that whole thing. He just went into the temple and kind of just threw all the tables over and said, no, none of this stuff is what it's about. So I don't know, maybe that doesn't really, I don't know what that means necessarily for us today, but I think it means something. It's something worth thinking about.
Yeah, that's an awesome perspective. I think that as I look at Jesus, it just seems that his ultimate goal was that, it kind of resembles some of the others we've said, but Jesus said, I'm going to win by any means necessary. I'm just going to win. If I have to get rough and tough with some folk in the temple and lay some physical hands on some folk, I will do that. If I have to lay down my life when I have the power to save it, I'm going to do that. Because if that's going to help me win, that's what I'm going to do. If I have to die and get up from a dusty tomb in order to win, I'm going to do that. And I think that Jesus was just so focused on the mission of winning, and winning for him, how he defined the winning. That was awesome how you put that. It was not just the oppressed. Jesus wanted to win the oppressor as well. So that's just a powerful thing. So look, just kind of wrapping this up, this is kind of what I'm getting. I'm getting out of these examples, this is what I'm finding. I'm finding that all 5 of these responses, peace, we're out, catch these rocks, march, shine a light, what was the other one? Assimilate and excel.
Assimilate, excel. Yeah.
All of them are and were legitimate responses to oppression, racism, and injustice. All of them.
Oh,
even David
Absolutely.
cutting off the giant, that was a legitimate response. And Sean, you have you've given me some stuff to think about as how to pitch and understand it, is that each one of them was catered to the specific time and the specific context under which that oppression and injustice and discrimination and racism was taking place. It was all the same. It was all racism and oppression and injustice, but there were certain elements about them that distinguished them from one another that called for God to allow. So you mentioned the thing about Jesus, that people look at Jesus and how he dealt with it in his time and in his context as an excuse to disengage from making some noise or doing anything like that. But it was also that same Jesus, that same God, who said, David, go handle this business out here with this giant. Moses, go handle this business with this Pharaoh. Get your people up out of it. It was the same God, commissioned by the same Holy Spirit to get out there and to do that. So there's not a single one of these, and this is a dangerous statement, but there's not a single one of these that are inappropriate. It's just that it has to be appropriate for the time and for the context under the inspiration of God to be able to handle it. So for those of you that are watching out there and you've been
$1 million question.
Yeah. But listen, there are people even now, particularly people of faith, who are trying to figure out, they know that oppression and injustice and discrimination is real, right? For some, they think it's a figment of people's imagination, but there are others who are not under that illusion. They know that it is real. They know that not only, as you brought out, it's not just individual, but that there are systemic issues at play still, and they are trying to figure out what is the response. How do we respond to it in the United States of America today? How do we respond to it in my city or in my workplace? Again, how you respond to it in your workplace might be very different to how you respond to it in the streets of your city or your town, and I think that's what I'm pulling from this conversation today, that the response to oppression and racism and injustice and discrimination is, one, it is not always the same, and two, to figure out what your response to be, that everyone in every one of these scenarios, we see that God was leading in how the people responded. Led Moses, led David, led Gideon, led Daniel, and in the Holy Spirit led Jesus as to how he was going to respond to those things. So a conclusion is, as you see things happening in your streets, do you go get you some rocks? Do you pick up everybody and move and do the self-determinating thing? Do you assimilate and excel? I think in the end, it's a matter that you've got to take up between you and God. However, just categorically, we cannot say that any of those issues is necessarily an evil and a wrong in and of itself. Context makes the difference. Sean, man, thank you so much for coming on Johnny on the spot here tonight. I appreciate your input and your insight. Thank you for joining me here on Twittic, because we're just sharing. This is what I guess tonight. This is what we think we know about this particular issue of culture and God. This is day 5 of the Vlogmas challenge. If you were out there tonight, and this is, I'd show you just this was one more thing before we go. This is practice for anybody who's doing Vlogmas right now, or Vlogmas. I don't even know how you pronounce it. Everybody's trying to put something out and get comfortable in a space that they're probably not all that comfortable with. I'm not very comfortable in the space, but every day practice gets better and better. Sometimes it feels worse because you learned you did something today better than you did yesterday, or you do something worse today because you're trying to remember something that you did yesterday and you forget what it was. But listen, I just want to encourage you, those of you that are struggling with getting into this space and having a voice, hop on in, try it. Even if you're watching this long after Vlogmas is done, I just want to encourage you. There's nothing to it but to do it. Doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have nice fancy circles and windows and graphics and all this kind of stuff. Just pick up your phone. There's over 2 billion people out there in a platform like YouTube. And if God has gifted you and placed a burden on your heart to say something, to share something, get out there and do it. God gave you a voice and he wants you to use it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Sean. Hello to your family and everything for us. God bless you. Have a great night.
All right.